All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here and welcome to the 5th annual Brain Awareness Week lecture at Hope College. Thank you for joining us. My name is Aaron Shantz, and I'm a counselor in the Counseling and Psychological Services Office. On behalf of the Brain Awareness Week Planning Committee, so Andrew Gall, Susan Ipri Brown, Aaron Welsh, Daphne Fairbanks, and with tremendous help from students, Kimberly Paquette, Matthew Summerfield, and the other Helping Minds members, a student organization who has put together demonstrations and been doing Brain Awareness Week activities in local classrooms this week. On behalf of all of us, we're glad you're here. As our committee gave some thought to the focus for this year's events, the global pandemic was swirling and many around us were experiencing real challenges to their resilience and mental health. In response, the team selected the theme of mindfulness for this year's festivities. We'd like to take a moment to thank those who made this event possible. So the Division of Natural and Applied Sciences and the Neuroscience program, the Division of Social Sciences, the Department of Psychology, Cultural Affairs Committee, Counseling and Psychological Services Office, and the Dana Foundation. Our speaker tonight, Dr. B. Grace Bullock, is the author of Mindful Relationships, 7 Skills for Success, Integrating the Science of Mind, Body, and Brain. We believe she's the perfect speaker for our event and for these times. She's titled her lecture, Mind and Brain, Engaging the Neuroscience of Mindfulness. If you're here for an academic lecture, you're in the right place. Dr. Bullock has received her PhD in clinical psychology with a specialization in child and family therapy, behavioral genetics, and affective neuroscience from the University of Oregon. Completed her clinical residency at the University of Washington School of Medicine and has published articles in numerous journals and publications. At the same time, if you're here tonight for practical ways that brain research can help you manage or improve your life, you too are in the right place. Dr. Bullock works as the Senior Mental Health Strategist at the Oregon Department of Education. She's been teaching yoga and mindfulness for years. Who knows, perhaps we'll even practice a skill or two in our time together tonight. If you have a mind, and I know you do, you're in the right place. Dr. Bullock will be speaking for about 45 minutes and then taking some questions. So if those questions form in you during the presentation, there'll be time to raise your hand and submit that question at the end of her time speaking. But without anything further, let's please give a warm Hope College welcome to Dr. B. Grace Bullock.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm just going to get my screen share going here and make sure I can see you all. Give me just a sec. Sorry, that moment of tension when you make sure that your technology is working the way you intended. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all who are supporting this event and the faculty of Hope College. It's really a privilege and an honor to be invited to join you. I'm seeing my internet connection is unstable. Aaron, can you hear me? No, I can't hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay. This always happens when you speak, right? All right. I'll keep asking if it keeps popping up. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you after I give my brief talk here. But I want to jump right in since we're here to think about mindfulness in the brain. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a brain? If you've got any paper in front of you, I'd be curious if you write it down. And later at the end, I'd be curious if you would input that into the chat. I'm just really wanting to know what comes to mind when you think of the word brain. All right. So historically, the brain in our culture has been given a lot of different attributes. We often think of the brain as, the supercomputer or the master controller. The brain responds to environment. It helps us to shape our activities. It dictates what our body does. And coming from the field of psychology, I often joke, and of course I graduated a while ago, but I often joke that I was only taught to consider psychological phenomenon from the neck up. And so in my training, I never gave any consideration of what happens from the neck down, which that has changed a lot in the intervening years. But I think that the idea of the brain as the super controller and the supercomputer computer has permeated our culture and our way of thinking about human behavior for over a century. And it's interesting now that the science is looking more at humans holistically, we're learning that that's not necessarily the case. In fact, what we are learning now is that the brain functions more like a first responder than a supercomputer. And by that, I mean that there's a lot of good science that shows that the body sends more signals up to the brain than the brain sends to the body. So instead of the brain running the show, the body is actually giving the brain tremendous amounts of input, and the brain's job is to read these signals and determine a response. So in terms of mindfulness, one of the key capacities that mindfulness is thought to affect is this idea of introspection, or the mind or the brain's ability to read the signals that come from the body. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but just to kind of frame this conversation around the fact that the brain in many respects is responding to the environment, many signals from the body, what comes from the outside, how the body interprets it, rather than being this supercomputer that determines all things that it does. But of course, we are here to talk about the brain, so I don't want to not do the brain justice in introducing it a little bit here. Sorry, I've got a little throat thing happening today. So if you've ever seen a brain or even envisioned a brain, it's amazing. I mean, there's nothing short of amazing. If you've ever looked at a cell, a single cell under a microscope, that cell has its own little cellular brain. It has its own cellular mechanisms, machines, genes, all of these things that function in this tiny little cell. The brain has at least 100 billion, with a B, of these cells. So just the fact that one cell is a miracle of itself, you have this entire structure called the brain that is organized around doing its particular function. That's 100 billion cells, which are referred to as neurons, and it weighs about 5 pounds. What's amazing about the brain is that when we are, and this is not unique to the brain, but I think this is an amazing part of the brain, is that the brain has a lot of these, what they call undifferentiated cells. And so when cells die, brain cells automatically know where to go and what to do. Or if someone has a brain injury, a lot of the times the reason why they're able to be rehabilitated is the brain has this amazing capacity to know how to regenerate and change itself. And that occurs throughout the lifespan. So again, I'm not trying to date myself, but back in the day where we studied neuroscience, the brain was thought to have, you were born with all of the brain cells you were going to get. And over the course of your lifespan, you lost brain cells, and eventually you die. But can you still hear me? I keep getting messages that I'm still good. Okay. But the thought was that you had a certain complement of brain cells and they disappeared. And that was one of the explanations for memory loss and things like that, because the understanding was that the brain, just continually deteriorated and was gone. What we now know is that the brain regenerates itself throughout the lifespan, and that even people in their 80s continue to regenerate new brain cells. So this is amazing from so many perspectives, one being the mindfulness perspective, because it tells us that we are endlessly capable of change and growth throughout the lifespan. And it's really miraculous that that's possible. The other thing that we know about brains, unlike the conventional wisdom, even in the previous century, was that a lot of the work around the brain looked at specific regions of the brain, and it attributed certain functions to certain regions. I'm going to be showing you a little bit of that and what I'm talking about. But what we know about now is that the brain actually operates through these incredible interconnected networks. So it's not just one piece of the brain that is responsible for a certain function, but the entire brain works as this beautiful symphony to make things happen. What we also know is that the body has a tremendous influence, again, sending all of these signals up to the brain. So we're these like amazing, miraculous creatures that have signals from the body, brain interprets it, brain regenerates, body regenerates. I mean, if you think about it, we're really walking miracles. It's pretty amazing. The other thing is that every brain is like a fingerprint. I could talk about this for a while. What's really cool about that is that we're all uniquely structured, in our brains. The difficulty with that is that there's been some emerging neuroscience that is finding that what we thought we knew from a lot of brain studies may or may not be entirely accurate, because a lot of brains were layered over each other in determining how to read the data, but that in putting all those brains together, we might have missed some of the really fine nuances of behavior that could not have been accounted for when we combined all brains, because all brains are not unique. It's kind of like me taking 10 people that are doing the same behavior and assuming that they're all doing it for the same reason. So again, we're learning a lot, and it's really fascinating. So the brain is amazing. And now I'm going to do exactly what I said I wasn't going to do, and reduce brain sections into areas so that you can get a kind of a sense of how this works and why what happens from the body in particular is really important. So in a very gross sense, the brain is divided into major components related to human behavior. The one in gray I'm not going to talk about. That's a lot of motor cortex, so sending and receiving information that controls motor movement. I'm not going to go there today, but I'm going to talk about things that are more related to the autonomic nervous system and human behavior. So with the lower part here, the brain is the brain stem and the medulla and the pons, and things that are related to function and relaying information between the body and the brain. And so those are very evolutionarily primitive brain states. So they're very much focused on survival. And of course, the psychological question from the point of a brainstem is, am I safe? Because the brainstem relates to the brain, what's going on in the body, and the brain and the body calibrate back and forth. The second state, which is often the focus of a lot of attention, is the limbic system, which is related to the emotional state. The limbic system gets a lot of bad rap because, interestingly, if you've heard of the term the amygdala hijack, which is a structure within the limbic system, the assumption is that when you're very emotional, it's bad. There's something wrong with that. But I want to dispel the myth, because the emotional state of the brain and the emotional parts of the brain are incredibly important for us to experience the richness of life. And if we didn't have that emotional part of the brain and it didn't interface with the rest of the brain, our lives would be pretty dull. So let's give the limbic system a break. But it is largely responsible for answering the question, am I loved? Am I getting my basic needs met? If you think about it from a developmental perspective with young children, safety and making sure that they have social connection is really at the heart of development at that age, but also survival. Incredibly important. Last but not least, and what develops in human developmental trajectory last is the prefrontal lobes, which are what are often referred to as the executive state. So the question is, what can I learn from this? And it is the part of the brain that is responsible for things like thinking, planning, reasoning, communication. So what are often referred to as higher order competencies. So that's just a basic roadmap of the brain, and now I'm going to up it a little bit to make it slightly more complicated. And here's why. So as I mentioned earlier, the brain is receiving all of these signals from the body through the brainstem. And again, far more information coming up than going down. So again, this is like a loosely described phenomenon, but the brain processes information in two different ways. There's bottom up processing, which is on the right-hand side, and top down, which is on the left-hand side. So I'm going to start with bottom up. So when the body sends signals to the brain, for example, I'm hungry, signals come up, and immediately, if you think about it, I don't know about you, but I'm one of those hangry people. Like if I get really hungry, my mood goes south and I get grouchy, right? So one of the reasons is because the body keeps saying, Grace, 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 feed me, feed me, feed me. And I ignore it. And at a certain point, the body's sending enough information up that I can't ignore it anymore. And that's where the emotions serve an important function, because the emotions are saying, oh, you're getting super grouchy, you need to do something about it. What's interesting is when we have a flood of information coming up from the body, we can often lose our ability to regulate our behavior because we are flooded from all of this information. So that's bottom up, and it's related to, again, issues of survival, issues of social connection, things that we need to thrive. If we always operated in this state, we would probably resemble 2-year-olds. So great, useful, but not always appropriate in the adult social sphere. On the other hand, we have what is called top-down processing. So this is, again, taking regions in the frontal area of the brain, and these regions can actually, how shall I say that, modify signals that are coming from the bottom up so that there's more of a balance between thinking and planning, reasoning, problem solving, communication, and those very visceral drives that are coming up from the body. So again, toddlers developmentally don't have this system online yet. So when they're getting, when they're hungry, they're just emotive. They just do their thing. But adults, ostensibly, have this capacity to think and plan and reason. The exception would be when we're having more sensations flooding up from the body than we can manage. And that's when we become more like this side of the diagram, we engage in more bottom-up processing. So that's the basic landscape of the brain. Now I'm going to move into how this all relates to the body, which is where I think it gets super cool. So we have two main branches of the nervous system in the body. There's the central nervous system, which is the nervous system, the branch of the nervous system that is responsible for motor movement. So I want to move my arm. That is my central nervous system that is making that happen. There's another branch of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, which I'm going to focus on now because it is directly related to a lot of those signals that go from the body to the brain and tell the brain it needs to do something to compensate for what's going on in the body, like feed me. So the autonomic nervous system is, it innervates or connects the brain to all of the major organs in the body. So if you look at this diagram, it's heart, lungs, gallbladder, kidneys, gut, bladder, sex organs, and everything in between. So what's interesting about the autonomic nervous system is that it largely functions without your conscious awareness. So imagine if I'm sitting here and I'm having to literally tell my heart to beat every second. So I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you, I was like, beat, 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 beat. And then my phone rings and I take a call, I stop thinking about my heart, and within a couple minutes I'm dead, right? So it's really important that all of these systems are without conscious or out of our conscious control, because we would have a really hard time managing otherwise. There is one exception, and sadly I can't see you or get input from you, so I'm just going to be a buzzkill and tell you what it is. The one autonomic function that you can control is your breath. So you can volitionally control how you breathe. For example, imagine if you couldn't hold your breath when you jumped into a swimming pool. You'd end up with a mouthful of water and you're probably breathing in water because you're trying to get air. So it serves a really important function that we can control our breathing. And it serves as a way for us to regulate our nervous system. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But back to the ANS, which it's called, it is broken into a number of different branches. The one I'm going to focus on most is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for activation and arousal. So it's like a gas pedal. You're driving down the street, somebody runs in front of your car, boom, you throw on the brakes. That's your sympathetic nervous system. it often acts before your brain has even had time to catch up and say, oh, someone just ran in front of my car. You've usually already braked before you have that realization. So it's activating, super important. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is like the brake pedal. So it is responsible for resting and digesting and repairing and restoration. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is often called the fight, flight, freeze system. Sorry. So they're very important. Again, we have this interesting duality in physiological science where the sympathetic nervous system gets a bad rap because, you know, it's like it's the driver. And we often think of the sympathetic nervous system as being responsible for burnout, which it is if you always have the gas pedal down and you're pressing down the clutch. Eventually the engine will burn out. But just like when you're driving, if you don't have a balance between gas pedal and brake, you're not going anywhere. So you need to have this balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And interestingly, every time you inhale, that's a sympathetic nervous system function. And every time you exhale, that's a parasympathetic nervous system function. So if you think about when you're trying to relax, what do? You inhale and then you kind of go, well, that's the calming influence of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's just like a cat purring. It has the same effect of soothing and downregulating the system. The other two that are really interesting that I don't have time to talk about today are the enteric nervous system, which is responsible for digestion, inhibition, and also emotion, think hangry. And amazingly, that nervous system holds a large proportion of your neurotransmitters. So things like dopamine and serotonin, a lot of that is produced or housed in the gut. So if you think about the adage that you are what you eat, your diet can have a big influence on your psychological state. I could talk about that for days because I think it's really cool, but I'll move on. And then there's an intercardiac nervous system, which is responsible for heart function. And again, if you think about it, heart, emotions, there are other wisdom centers in the body that are largely responsible for our experience. So I think that that's just, you know, some really cool science that has emerged in the last few decades. So what does all this mean? We got a brain, we got a nervous system. How do we relate it to life? Well, here's the thing that kind of puts the brain and the nervous system on its ear is stress. So I'm going to talk about stress because I think that that takes the idea of the brain and the nervous system and gives us some practical application that we can wrap our heads around. So stress generally refers to any ongoing demand that without a known ending, so serious stress, that threatens or exceeds the physical or psychological resources of an individual. Okay, so anything that challenges you, that's a demand that kind of makes you pause and go, ooh, this is something I need to deal with, that could be considered a stressor. There are three major kinds of stress. One is called eustress. So eustress is the kind of stress, or eustress, depending on how you stress it. Eustress has an interesting function in that it relates to the stress that we experience when we choose to do something stressful. So coming and public speaking, for many of us, it's stressful. So it is a stressor. If you decide you want to go bungee jumping or take on some, daredevil-y kind of sport, even if you choose it, it is stressful to your system. So that is one form of stress. And it's also the form of stress that often motivates us to do something different and novel. So it's actually helpful and adaptive. The second kind of stress is distress. So stressful events that cause us to feel literally stressed or stressed out. That's the stress that we most often refer to when we talk about stress. And then the third type of stress is chronic stress. And chronic stress is the one that we need to pay most attention to because it's the form of stress that has the greatest negative impact on our health and well-being. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So when we're chronically stressed, we're in those situations where we feel like there's just no way out. It's endless. It could be a job where you go every day. And it's like, oh my gosh, I need my job. I can't leave my job, but it's stressing me out. And the interesting thing about chronic stress, like any habit or pattern, is we can get so used to being chronically stressed that we forget it's there. It just becomes a way of being. And I think that's even more so when we risk health consequences because we're not aware of how bad it is. But it's incredibly harmful to the mind and the body and the brain, mostly because chronic stress is associated with systemic inflammation. And systemic inflammation affects every single system in the body, including the brain. You think about all of these illnesses that are listed here: emotional problems, heart disease, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, increases risk for cancer. So whenever you have chronic systemic inflammation within the system, it increases the likelihood for disease. So it's a real problem. Back to our friend, the brain. Again, when the brain is experiencing stress, and this is another way that I talked about it, you saw these originally, the lower parts of the brain are experienced with I am. It's literally like, I am here, I am alive, I am. The second one is I feel, and the third one, again, prefrontal, is I think. When we get super stressed, we're doing bottom-up processing. So all of those signals are flooding in from the body, and those signals can tend to dominate the signals coming from the prefrontal cortex, or in some cases disable them altogether. And so that is why when we're feeling stressed, it's much more difficult for us to pay attention, to be present in conversation, to take other people's perspective, to communicate effectively, to be rational. So again, when we're feeling a lot of stress, we're not showing up as our best selves. So how does this relate to mindfulness? I think mindfulness is in many ways extremely related to stress, because many of us don't even think about taking up a mindfulness practice until we're needing to do something differently. Most people I talk to is for various motivations, but a lot of the time the motivation was centered around stress. So my definition of mindfulness is that it is a way of being in relationship to yourself or with yourself and others, where we set an intention. So intention, I intend to pay attention to our experience and the effect that we are having on others. My little addition is that we do that with an attitude of kindness or of compassion. So we try to be kind and compassionate to the best of our ability. But essentially, it's a way of paying attention and observing our experience and how we affect other people. So super speedy covering of the science. So there are many, many, many studies now of the impacts of mindfulness on the brain, not only regions of the brain, but neural networks. Here are a few of my favorites, but they're in no way the be all end all. In the first one, Lutz et al. Looked at the effects of mindfulness on the amygdala, which again, limbic system, emotional system. And they found that part of the brain after mindfulness practice tends to be less active and less dense. And density is a reflection in neuroscience of how much something is used after mindfulness practice. The implication there is that it helps people to regulate their emotions better, not that emotions are bad. The second study here, Golden and Gross, they looked at the hippocampus following mindfulness practice. The hippocampus is a very cool brain region that is responsible for everything around memory, short-term, long-term consolidation, super important. And it is one of the regions of the brain that gets really affected by stress. So, if you're going through a period of chronic stress and you forgot where you place your keys. Yesterday, my husband found his cell phone in the refrigerator. So that kind of thing. Yeah, it was a thing. We kept calling and we couldn't hear it because it was in the fridge. Anyway, the hippocampus is really affected by stress. And so another study done by Golden and Gross, they found that people after mindfulness training, that their hippocampus was more active, suggesting that there was a beneficial effect to the hippocampus and potentially learning and memory. In some of the other studies, Chisia and Soretti looked at prefrontal cortex, which you now know as responsible for higher order functionings, thinking, planning, reasoning. They found that after mindfulness practice, that region also became more active following that training, which suggests that people might be better at things like self-awareness, impulse control, impulsivity, again, all of the things related to that part of the brain. So the sum is basically that what we know from those pieces of research is that there's some kind of strengthening or rewiring of the brain that goes on in relation to consistent, I will add, mindfulness practice. If you stop, it all goes away. It's just like working out. So, in a meta-analysis of 21 neuroimaging studies, let's see, Fox et al. Found that meditation practitioners had a lot of differences between meditators and non-meditators. Sorry, it's getting late in my day too. And I think even more interesting than that, the last study that I wanted to talk about was a study done looking at the protective effects of meditation for people over the age of 50. And in that study, they found that people that had been meditating for quite some time had a significant difference in their brain, in that their brains were showing that they were far younger, like literally physically younger than the brains of non-meditators. The way they measured that was looking at the length of their telomeres, which is at the end of chromosomes. And the longer the telomeres, the younger the brain is interpreted to be. And the more the presence of telomerase, which is what is the building block of telomeres, the more presence of that in the system was also equated with a younger brain. So we didn't ask people if the brains were younger, but there was some evidence that it served a buffering effect. So big takeaway about the world's shortest review on the mindfulness, the effects of mindfulness in the brain, is that concentration and focused attention practices, so practices where you need to sit and focus on something, it might be your breath, it might be a thought, it might be nothing, tend to stimulate growth of neurons, remember neurons, cells in the brain, that we see increased connectivity and efficiency in the brain in meditators. And there's also an improved awareness of mental and bodily processes. Remember I talked about interoception? We get better at reading what's coming up from the body. Or in my case, we stop ignoring the fact that we're hungry and we do something about it instead of ignoring everything altogether. We also learned that meditation may buffer against the brain against effects of chronic stress. So in some other studies, they've seen that in people that meditate, they have a reduced pro-inflammatory response. So again, less inflammation in response to stress. Whoops, again, I mentioned, now I'm not stressing myself out at all. Stimulating telomerase activity, which is telomeres and aging. And also they saw less shrinkage and functional loss in people that meditated. So not a bad thing. I wanted to talk about a few more benefits of mindfulness. And again, there's a huge literature on this. If you don't want to read the science, but you want to get a good broad brush, Mindfulness or Mindful magazine and their online website does a really good job of unpacking neuroscience for those who don't want to read neuroscience articles. But generally speaking, mindfulness has been shown to be beneficial for people with mood disorders. So less depression, less anxiety, and in some studies, mindfulness-based interventions like mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy have been found to be as effective as mainstream interventions. People practicing mindfulness tend to have less workplace stress. There's some interesting studies looking at the fact that leaders that practice mindfulness have less stress and are more effective. And a study of healthcare workers or mental health of healthcare workers, there we go, showed that they also experienced benefits from mindfulness practice. So what's the secret sauce? Everybody asks me, what's the, why is this happening? I only have a hypothesis. I'm not going to say that I think that there's enough research to support it that I'll stand by it. But in my humble opinion, the secret sauce is that when people engage in mindfulness practice, they tend to be less stressed. And the less stressed we are, the more healthy we tend to be. So I think that intervening on stress is really where it's at. I also think, and I wrote a book about this, that mindfulness can be really, really useful in terms of our relationships. So really quick, down and dirty about John Gottman. John Gottman is a researcher who appears on the left in the cartoon, who studied the impacts of stress on relationship. And when he studied hundreds of couples that he not only observed on video, but he wired them up so he looked at their physiological responses. And he found that for most people, when their heart rate was elevated above 100 beats per minute, respiration increases, that feeling where you feel that flush of redness coming, that they basically couldn't communicate effectively. And they were more likely to use overlearned dysfunctional coping strategies like, woulda, shoulda, couldas, and you always leave the socks on the floor, and always and never, and catastrophizing. So people that were really stressed had a much harder time communicating. That tells me the mantra of today, regulate before you communicate. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling aroused and charged up, you need to regulate. What does that mean? So my book, I covered a bunch of different fun regulatory strategies, and I'm going to focus today on the breath because we talked a little bit about why the breath matters, but there are lots of possible strategies you can use. But for my money, I will always start with the breath because that downgrades the physiology that's making me kind of crazy in the first place. So here is my favorite tool. It is called the window of tolerance, and I'm going to give you a really short version of the window of tolerance. So just as I talked before, sometimes we can be upregulated. So our sympathetic nervous system is on overdrive, and we're feeling like we had 10 cups of coffee, and we're angry and reactive, and we feel like life is out of control. I just talked like that. So that is an upregulated sympathetic nervous system. Then there's the downregulated sympathetic nervous system. So we might feel sluggish and unmotivated, forgetful, zoned out, like I just don't even want to deal with life. So that's downregulated. So as humans, we function somewhere in the spectrum of really upregulated, really downregulated, but there's a sweet spot in the middle called our window of tolerance. And that's the window that gives us a sense of how much we can actually, how much space we have for coping with life. Example, in the morning I get up, it's a new day, I feel great. I have a lot more bandwidth for, my cat throwing up on my computer. End of the day, I'm tired, I'm grumpy, I've been staring at a screen all day. I have this much bandwidth. My cat throws up on my computer, I'm like, it's a big deal, right? So it's important to understand where we fall on this window, get used to knowing, and that's the mindfulness piece, observing our experience and using this or other tools to say, hey, I'm hungry, I'm cranky, I can't talk to you right now, and then figuring out what we need to do to compensate. So I'm going to talk about one way that we can compensate when we're upregulated. Quick primer on the breath. So I talked about when we inhale, that sympathetic nervous system function. So when we inhale, the diaphragm, big muscle, contracts, that's engagement, drops down, creates negative air pressure, air comes in. And then when we exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, parasympathetic nervous system function. And then the air goes out, magically, just like that. So we can use the breath to create that parasympathetic nervous system experience. How do we do it? There's two ways. One, I see this all the time. I'm just going to take a deep breath now. Well, you just activated your sympathetic nervous system. Yay! So if you're really sluggish, you could do that. It's not my choice, but it's possible. But how this works is it's not about the inhale. Inhale is activating. You want to exhale as long and slow as you can. And if you do this while I continue the rest of what I'm talking about, and even focus on slowing down my exhale, making it a little longer, making it a little softer. You may fall asleep by the time I get to my last slide, and that's okay. You might start yawning too, because that actually says that your parasympathetic nervous system is being activated. So give it a try while I finish talking, and then we'll go to questions. So of course, being the scientist that I am, I need to give you some rationale for this. There are a lot of interventions looking at the relationship between breathing and psychological states. I would still venture, like I do with the mindfulness science, that we still have a lot to learn, but there are a lot of studies pointing to breathing interventions like the one I just mentioned, sometimes they're more complicated, as being associated with reduced negative mood, also known as increased positive mood, better sustained attention, less stress, less anxiety. I mean, you can just read the list. So there is an evidence base, a research base to show that when we manipulate the breath in a certain way, we can change our psychological experience. But if we're not mindful of how we're breathing, we can't do that. So we do need to start paying attention to how you're breathing. If you're anything like me, you might notice that you hold your breath a lot. So pay attention to if you're holding your breath. That's one often frequent culprit. All right, last but not least, and this is one of my favorite things to cover, breath and then mind. The mind, right? I mean, the mind is such a source of stress. If you stop and pay attention to it, your brain is telling stories all the time. Even when you go to sleep, your brain's trying to tell stories in your dreams. The brain is a highly precocious thing, and it likes to generate what I call the suffering top 10. So, you know, we worry, we judge, we compare, we guilt, shame, we regret. So all of those things, some of those things, maybe none of those things, but most of us tend to get stuck in one of them. The interesting thing about the mind is that if you don't name what's going on in the mind, you can't tame what's going on in the mind. So it's really important, again, mindfulness practice, if you have the bandwidth for it, is to start paying attention to your thoughts, and you will likely learn a lot. I cover this quite a bit in the book, and when I teach this in workshops, it's one of my favorite things to teach because we spend a lot of time diving into how thoughts and stories and narratives affect how we are in the world. So I'm going to, first of all, ask you if you can read this. Can you read this? Is that readable? No? Okay, I'm going to read it. So this is my favorite thought exercise, and it's a poem that was written by a student, a high school student, and it's called The Worst Day Ever. And so the deal is you read it from the top down, and then you read it from the bottom up. So I'm going to do it. If you can read it, ignore me. Here we go. Today was absolutely the worst day ever. And don't try to convince me that there's something good in every day, because when you take a closer look, the world is a pretty evil place. Even if some goodness does shine through once in a while, satisfaction and happiness don't last. And it's not true that it's all in the mind and the heart, because true happiness can only be obtained only if one's surroundings are good. It's not true that good exists. I'm sure you can agree that the reality creates my attitude. It's all beyond my control, and you'll never in a million years hear me say that today was a good day. Upside down, same words. Today was a good day. And you'll never in a million years hear me say that it's all beyond my control. My attitude creates the reality. I'm sure you can agree that it's not true that good exists only if one's surroundings are good. True happiness can be obtained because it's all in the mind and the heart. And it's not true that satisfaction and happiness don't last. Some goodness does shine through once in a while, even if the world is a pretty evil place. Because when you take a closer look, there's something good in every day. And don't try to convince me that today was absolutely the worst day ever. I think that's the most brilliant example of how we can look at the same thing, and depending upon how our mind chooses to interpret it, it can go one way or another. So thank you, Candy Gordon. All right, so last but not least, mindfulness is a way of being in relationship to ourselves and others. These are some of the skills that I think are particularly useful in cultivating mindfulness, whether it's a formal practice or not. First, we got to pause. If we keep going like hamsters on a hamster wheel, it's really hard to be mindful because we're too busy spinning out. Second, start paying attention to your window of tolerance and learn to talk about it. When I learned about the window of tolerance, I found it very liberating because I could say to, colleagues or my husband, hey, window's small. I can't do this right now. Let me go take the dog for a walk and I'll come back. It's a really handy tool. There's not a lot of stigma attached to it. So it's nice. Use breath and body-based tools to regulate your nervous system and your mind. Again, breath is great. I practice a lot of yoga because it gets me in touch with my breath and I get to move because I have a hard time sitting still. So again, you can combine breathing with singing. Also, when you sing, long exhale. So there are lots of ways you can practice breath. Regulate before you communicate. If you feel your heart racing, even if you're in a faculty meeting, slow it down. We can do this. You can do this. Get to know your stories and examine them. Not the most fun in the world, but I think it's useful. Practice whatever you choose to practice regularly. One of my main mindfulness practices, full disclosure, is walking my dog twice a day. No phone, no nothing. I just focus on nature. I focus on playing with my dog. And that really gets me in touch with how I'm feeling and how I'm doing. So that's, it's not a formal practice, but it works and I do it every day. Humor. Life is serious, but we don't have to take it so seriously. We need to laugh. We need to have some joy. We need to find the humor in everything, including our own stuff. And engage with others with kindness and compassion. Try to think about other people's experience and hold it with just as much, love and space as we would our own. And last, I invite you to commit to one small change. And it could just be recognizing that when you wash the dishes, that's a mindfulness practice. It doesn't have to be super complicated. So here's some resources if you choose to look at them. I write for Mindful Magazine. I think they're great. They have a great online platform. Magazine's super cool too. I'm a huge fan of calm.com. They keep building out their sleep stories, and sleep is something I always need help with. So I think it's a great app. Insight Timer is an app as well that has lots of free meditations and lots of different offerings now. My book, which I'm particularly fond of, which covers a lot of this in more detail. And I live in Oregon, and I'm a big believer in the great outdoors and the potential to engage in mindfulness practice and also just be nurtured and rejuvenated by what is occurring outside of us. So I am going to take us off screen, Sarah, so I can see you, and maybe we can jump to questions. All right. Can we all see each other again? Yeah. Aaron, is everybody back? Okay,
Yeah,
yes.
I think everyone's here. But if you're with us, please, Grace would really like to have you show up on video. So just to be able to kind of see all of you, and maybe you're formulating your questions and you'd like to submit those through the chat feature, or at least let us know that you have a question, and we'll select you and let you ask the question. And when I say we, I believe I mean someone else. So
And that was a big data dump, so they don't have to be, beautifully formulated questions. Just ask what interests you. Or do we need to do some collective breathing first? Oh, cool. Egypt. Wow. Welcome, Mohammed. I have a member of my team who's from Egypt. Huh. So question from Daphne is, can we think of the parasympathetic nervous system as peace and the sympathetic nervous system as survival? Um, so my invitation to you is to not think about them as separate or dual, like dualistic. Don't think about them as separate. Or, you know, when I see that, my brain kind of goes, sort of pathologizing, good, bad, you know, peace is beautiful, survival is kind of like nitty gritty. I would encourage you to think about them as both necessary and very important, and that they work in balance. So, you know, one's the music, one's the dance, you need them both. But when the sympathetic nerve, so when we're stressed, and we go into what's called sympathetic nervous system dominance, and we get stuck in these feedback loops of, you know, high heart rate, high blood pressure, faster respiration, harder time, you know, you know what it's like when you're stressed out. Illness is more likely to occur, and our relationships are more likely to suffer. So it's more about maintaining balance than thinking about one is good and one is not as good. That help? Thank you. Great question. Okay, Sydney, what is one piece of advice you would give someone who is just starting their mindfulness journey? Oh, that's a good question. Be patient. Expect that it's not always going to feel good, that it requires commitment, and that if you're having trouble sticking to it, don't beat yourself up. Last but not least, you know, when I first started this, I can tell you stories. I mean, I was like a mindfulness disaster. I just wanted to be really good at it. Like my whole thing, I started with Zen meditation, which probably was the hardest place to start because I can't sit still, and literally meditation practices 45 minutes staring at a wall and you can't move. I mean, I couldn't have picked the worst thing to try. And so I tried it for 2 years and I was going to perfect it. I was going to be like the best meditator. I was going to be like sit still perfectly and never get in trouble because I fidget and you get in trouble. I was going to be the best meditator ever. 2 years into it, I was miserable. I hated it. It sucked. It was actually causing me more stress. And I realized this is not my thing. So I stumbled upon yoga by accident while I was working on my dissertation. I was somewhere in graduate school. And I went to a gym class, and I kind of jockey, so I want to do like, oh, I want to do that, and like take my foot in my hand and go, woo, you know. And so I stumbled upon it by accident, but it turned out to be really good for me. True story. I could never get through Shavasana, which is lying still doing nothing at the end. I was ran out. And I didn't really begin to embrace yoga until I had a really bad hip fracture. And the only thing the doctor would let me do movement-wise was yoga by the time I got out of that. And so that was the first time I sat still long enough to pay attention. So beautiful question. And the other thing I would say is, Cindy, explore. You don't have to meditate. Just find something that works for you, because there are all these different tools and they're all available to you. And like I said, walking the dog is the one that works the best for me. Even though I practice a lot of yoga, I consider my dog walking to be one of my best and most beneficial practices. So be kind to yourself and just try stuff and see what happens. Other thoughts? I know it's a lot later where you guys are. I'm still in daylight, so. There's got to be a burning question. Oh, in what ways does mindfulness affect sleep? Good question. The research shows that people who practice mindfulness regularly sleep better. I may be one of these exceptions, because when I became really mindful of my thoughts, I became really mindful of my thoughts racing a lot at night. So initially, it didn't work so well for me. But once I started doing the breathing, paying attention to the breath, slow, long breaths, slow, long breaths, it started to help me to wind down so I could actually get to sleep. But full disclosure, I still sometimes get the racing mind, especially now that we're in a legislative session. My mind just races, races, races. So I turn on a sleep story. I listen to a story and it puts me to sleep. Sometimes I just can't mobilize the resources to turn my mind off to let me get to sleep. It's a great question though. Hopefully it'll work well for you. What do you do to remember to practice mindfulness during peak times of distress? Oh boy, you asked me a hard question, but I'll tell you what I do. What works for me is, and again, this is a practice, but I start paying attention to my breath, and I start paying attention to what's going on in my body. If I'm holding my breath, that's a clue. If my shoulders are up around my ears and I'm in pain, that's a clue. So sometimes for me, feeling crappy is the biggest reminder to me that I need to do something differently. When I'm like really happy and life is wonderful and everything is blissful, honestly, it's a lot harder to practice because I don't experience the benefit as acutely as when I feel lousy. But over time, I realized that when I keep up my practice, it's beneficial. And I think that that's one of the reasons that one of my practices is walking the dog, because it's something I know I will do. Again, finding something that you know you will do is extremely important. I know people that their practice is washing the dishes and they literally like hands in water, hands in water, you know, oh, I'm paying attention to my thoughts. I'm just having this argument with my partner in my head. So it doesn't have to be magical, but if you can pick one thing and say, this is my practice, I'm going to turn off the phone, I'm going to, you know, whatever, and really focus on your experience, I think that that's where it's at. Any special mindfulness ideas for various times of life? Oh, perimenopause? Let's talk offline on that one. Yuck, been there. Oh gosh, that's a great question. You know, the breathing for me has been worth its weight in gold. Perimenopausal, just like body yucky mood, pain, yoga, gentle yoga, restorative yoga, things that move me, that allow me to, you know, just not get all stuck in pain cycles. And then big fan of walking outside, walking, hiking, anything outdoors. I think that counts as a mindfulness practice as long as you're not on your phone the whole time. Would faith-based practices, oops, it just popped, hold on a second. Would faith-based practices such as prayer count as mindfulness? Absolutely, yes, yes, yes. I worked with a client who had a lot of anxiety and panic, and it was, we worked a lot in yoga because we need to ground her in her body because she was very much in her head. And, but at a certain point, she started having a lot of, you know, anxious thoughts, repetitive thoughts, ruminations. And she was extremely, really devoted to her Christian faith, which is not something that I'm like personally connected with. And so one of the tools that we use in yoga is mantra. So repetition of the same phrase over and over again is a way to distract the mind from, you know, rumination. And so I asked her, I said, is there a prayer that you say when you need soothing? And she said, yes. And like, so she repeated it to me. And I said, that's your new mental mindfulness practice. You're already doing it. So when you feel yourself getting stuck in anxious thoughts, repeat that prayer. And it worked really, really well. So that's a long answer to your question, but big yes, yes. Ryan, can you discuss further the relationship between mindfulness and pain injury? Ooh. I'm thinking in particular about someone doing a mindful exercise that has them scanning or attending to a particular part of the body that might be injured or in pain. I lead my classes in mindfulness exercises, but recently had a student mention the activity we did highlighted the pain we're in. Oh, what a great question. Not all practices are for everyone. I think of this really as a very personal enterprise. And so body scans, you know, body scans can be really, really complicated. If you have people with any kind of eating disorder, chronic pain, anything where they're focused on their body, anxiety that's driven by breath or heart type things, focusing on body can really have iatrogenic effects. So I'm really, when I work with larger groups, I often stick with breath practices because they tend to be, and really basic breath practices. Like I would have, had I had more time, spend a little time doing a breath practice with you. But even 5 minutes of paying attention to your breath and lengthening your exhale, usually it's okay. But I'm always the caveat. So I have really severe asthma. When I started doing breathing exercises, it actually had the opposite effect, and I started having more anxiety. So mindfulness practices, particularly in group settings, should always be invitational. No one should ever be required to do a practice. And if you want to do it in a group, it's an invitation. If it's not working for you, you can put your head down on your desk if you're working with students. You can doodle, you can do something else, but always make sure that you're creating another option for people to practice and that they never feel obligated. Because I think obligation is the easy way to get people to stop practicing. You're welcome. I'm looking and I'm aware that we're out of time. So, and I'm aware that we're losing people. So I'm going to defer to you all to figure out what you want to do.
Is there any last questions that I want to answer before we thank her? Thank you so much for taking your time. I know you're in the middle of your workday on our 7 o'clock time to come out here from Oregon. We very much appreciate being part of our Brain Awareness Week. We've been in the schools all week. We're going to have our family event on Saturday, and we're just glad that you made us all pause and be mindful to you for the hour. And so that's hopefully what we all needed as well today. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone.